So that kind of tees up the next part of this conversation, I guess, doesn't it, Nick, where we're going to go into a bit more detail. We've called this heading east. And we wanted to take a pulse check first on where people were at in terms of S4, ECC, what their plans were, to make sure we tailored the content a little. So I'm going to go back to the blue house that I mentioned earlier. And I'm going to go back into make-believe world for a second. I'm going to imagine that this house is in LA. So it's sat right on the west coast in LA. And the people who live in this house, the business people, want to make a move over to the East Coast. They don't know where in the East Coast they want to go to yet. They just want to move to the East Coast. They may decide to settle for Chicago and not go quite that far, but they may actually just head north and stay in Seattle for a while. And on the way there, what they may do is take one of the great American kind of road trips. They may take the Pacific Coast Trail and the Great Northern across the top. They may go cross-country, Oregon Trail, our longest road, and end up in kind of Boston or Washington. They may take Route 66 and risk it. They may take the South Pacific Road. Or if they get lost halfway, they might cut back across country north to south and take the Great River Road. Now, the reason I mention that is because that's kind of like what you guys have got ahead of you. If you're over on the left-hand side now with ECC, you can either stay in ECC and do nothing for a while. As Nick said, the people on the right-hand side of that clock diagram before are just sitting tight, not even sweating the asset. They're just making sure the asset gets maintained. And then gradually head across country and maybe head elsewhere along the way. You could be on S4 already. You could be thinking of going greenfield, thinking of going brownfield. You could even be considering third-party maintenance or even doing something different or going best of breed. And whichever one of those things you're doing, you've got kind of a different set of challenges. If you're going greenfield, for example, then you've got a brand new, fresh system to play with. If you're going brownfield, it might look the same on the surface, but you may be carrying a lot more baggage inside it. Third-party maintenance, it was interesting looking at this. I Googled, is it dangerous driving Route 66? And Google said, sadly, it's no longer feasible to drive the entire route as many sections are cracked, potholed, and impassable. But in its heyday, stretches of bloody Route 66 were hazardous for motorists. And that's the thing to think about around those guys who are thinking about third-party maintenance in order to save costs, is they're probably going to end up turning round or winding up in Chicago anyway and doing something completely different. And if you're going to do something else and look at different platforms, you've got a big building job on your hands. It's a construction job. So if you run a COE, you've got to think about all of that stuff. And at the same time, you've got to think about reducing your cost base. You've got to think, as Nick said earlier, about delivering value to the business now. Gone are the days of people taking 5 or 10 years to do a migration. Now, we've spoken to SAP customers recently who are looking at brownfield and think maybe they can do it in 7 years. And the world is going to be a very different place in 7 years. And if they can't deliver value now alongside that, then they're not going to be businesses in 7 years' time. You have to reduce risk. And you need to have a clear roadmap, because if the business says, where are we going? You can't say, we're not sure yet. So I'm going to drop that metaphor there, and I'm going to ask Nick to overlay that with some practical advice. And Paul asked the question before, is the house different if you're on ECC or S4? So I think you should park that for a second, and I think you should focus on some fundamentals that you need to have in your COE, and having your COE planning now, despite which journey you're going to go on, and even if you don't know which route you're going to take. So I'll hand over to you to give us some input.
Okay, number one on the list is probably no surprise based on the dialogue that you've heard throughout the course of this. I'm very deliberately going to go back to Michael Doan's comment that Paul referred to earlier. Be obsessed with business processes is absolutely true, and in many cases it's probably more important now than it even was back then. We talked about a list. Stuart talked about what is SAP. Well, it's just a list of business processes, and at its heart, that's true. But you need to be able to do something with that definition and categorization of business processes. So taking a simple list and turning that into a catalog, but then using that catalog to categorize your business processes, to understand where processes are highly complex, the degree of operational frequency, how commoditized is a process. But perhaps one of the most important parts today is really understanding how your processes support competitive advantage. Now, that could be top line competitive advantage, it's a true differentiator for your business, or it could be bottom line, just as important, but it's about reducing cost, for example. So having a list of processes is one thing. Really understanding the processes in that much lower level of detail to understand their importance to the business is what starts to turn the COE into a much more powerful organization. You can't really do that, though, and you're probably unlikely to have that level of definition unless the business already has that concept of process ownership. And you heard me mention, just a short while ago, that still a large number of organizations out there don't have that concept of process ownership. And that's kind of okay, but leading organizations do, and they're the ones who have that very clearly articulated strategy. And from a COE perspective, once you know the strategy, once you're clear on where the process owners want to go and they have a well-defined roadmap, you can play an absolutely fundamental part in delivering against the business strategy and helping the business to be successful.
Yeah. And it's also, if you go back to the 90s and early 2000s, a lot of early SAP programs had a business process master list, and it drove the program scope. But most people let that kind of deteriorate after go live and never really maintained it. And a lot of our consulting at the moment focuses on almost like forensically recovering that as a start point to give people the focus back in the COE, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a really good point you raise about when you're in program implementation mode. The BPML, is such a fundamental part of that, and there's huge amounts of things that drop off it. So requirements traceability matrix comes directly from the BPML. Understanding the training requirements, understanding the testing requirements from the RTM. All of those things are driven from the BPML. So you think it's vitally important when you implement, but why shouldn't it be just as important, if not more, once you're live? Every COE is delivering releases of new functionality all of the time. We just heard about all those organizations who are currently sweating the asset. Sweating the asset means doing a whole series of continuous improvement activity that ultimately ends up in a release that goes through to production. So why is the BPML and documents like the RTM not just as important now when you're dealing with a live system as it was when you're actually implementing?
Yeah. So number 2, Nick.
Improvement model. So, directly linked to this conversation about process owners and the process catalog. So here we're talking about the direction of the business. Nothing ever stands still in SAP. Once you're live, you're constantly delivering releases, as we just said. There's ongoing continuous improvement. But how do you know what to deliver? Who decides? Who prioritizes? Who makes the cash available for you to deliver those continuous improvement releases? That's all part of the improvement model. And it ties directly back to the concept of process ownership and process sponsorship. In organizations that do this really well, if you think about an overarching business strategy, the process owners have clearly defined roadmaps and portfolio plans where they can demonstrate how that roadmap supports the business strategy. Drop that down the level, and every new requirement that comes from the business in terms of a change in SAP should immediately be validated against the GPO's roadmap. And if it doesn't support something that's on the GPO's roadmap and therefore supporting business strategy, why waste your money doing it?
Yeah.
But far too often you see that rush to, we have a whole list of enhancement requests, changes, whatever you choose to call them, but no real method to prioritize those or determine how they're going to be funded. So the improvement model is all about the alignment with business strategy, with process ownership, what's important with the business. And to do that effectively, you've got to understand your processes, you've got to understand and have that business process list defined. That's what drives good prioritization. That's what drives good release planning within a COE.
Yeah. And back to the patio point before, if you think that's about charm, you're beneath the patio. If you think that's ALM, you're beneath the patio. If you think it's about Six Sigma or Hoshin Kanri, you're above the patio. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That more strategic alignment, totally.
So number 3?
Immaculate data mentality. If I think about the number of times that I've written this in our advisory pieces recently with a number of clients, it comes up all the time. So data has always been vitally important. We all know that. Think about the amount of time we spend on data preparation for any go live, whether that be an implementation or an individual release. Everybody talks about data, and they all recognize it's really important. And it's probably become even more important over the last few years. So with a shift to analytics, insights, the desire for better management information, data lakes, AI, big data, AI, RPA. You just keep adding those things on top of it. Fundamentally, they're all based on data. Now, they're all great, but if your data's wrong, then the insights aren't going to be very helpful. I guess in the worst case scenario at the moment, if the data's wrong, are you going to have a robot that's going off, developing a mind of its own and doing crazy things? Who knows? But data needs to be right. Everybody accepts that. But many times it's not. So from a COE perspective, having a mindset that's not just about data quality, data maintenance, data management, but about immaculate data. It has to be absolutely right. It has to be 100% correct. Again, this is what's starting to separate the average COEs from those that do this really, really well. And there are a number of different aspects associated with data, and we could probably run a whole session on this. But across that data space, we mean everything from really robust data governance. Who owns that data? Who's really deciding what the data needs to be and what the data standard is going to be? Well, who's managing and maintaining that data and making sure it hits those standards? And then who's auditing and stewarding that data to make sure that's in line with everything that you've agreed? So this isn't just about data maintenance organizations. It's a whole gamut of new roles that basically exist in COEs that previously weren't there.
And it's easy. I think it's taken us 20 years to come up with that phrase, actually, and we've changed it along the way. But data quality is a fairly banal name, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't say what the quality has to be. Immaculate is you can
know what immaculate means, yeah.
And you can never be immaculate, but you can strive for immaculate. And to your point on data cleansing, it's always really frustrated me that people spend millions on data cleansing, data load routines, data quality at go live, and 5 minutes after go live, they don't. The cleanliness is gone. They don't use the same data cleansing routines after go live. They don't focus on things like grey data reports and data outliers and spikes in data, when it's really easy to do. You just need the organization, capability, and focus to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And an interesting anecdote on that in terms of how often we use this language. So one of our retail customers who has a centre of excellence, we ran a centre of excellence maturity workshop with them. And off the back of that discussion, their data team is now actually called the Immaculate Data Team. So they changed the name because they totally get the importance. So if you think about this in terms of retail and the insights that you need, that the information that comes from points of sale, that goes into their category management teams in procurement, the feedback from customers, they absolutely have to have immaculate data, and they pick this up and they run with it.
I guess the other thing that's happened in the last 20 years, or the last 7 of the last 20 years, is you've exposed your data more to consumers and more to B2B partners directly than you ever did before.
Yeah, true.
Digital means it's in other people's hands.
Yeah, you have less control over it, in fact, other than making sure it's accurate. Once it's out there, there's a whole series of reasons, activities, things that people can do with your data.
Yeah. So number 4 is adoption, which I think is a really interesting and underrated word in the enterprise software space.
Yeah, and when we did our SAP survey, the factors that drive success for SAP customers a couple of years ago, adoption was the number 1 factor that drove the success of SAP programs. But we're talking about centers of excellence here today. So clearly the focus on adoption, not just change management, is key when you're in implementation mode. So change management and training is about preparing you for go live. Adoption is the everything else that happens after that. And in days gone by, most people didn't ever really focus on adoption. You would have post-go live support, you'd train the users, you'd enable them to get support when they needed it, but there wasn't that laser-like focus on adoption. The organizations, again, that do this well have an absolute focus on adoption. It's more than just change in training.
It's also measuring adoption as well, and not just measuring have people adopted the business processes that we've transformed, but are they adopting them consistently across the business, in each business unit, in each region? Are the people in Poland and the people in Chicago using the same transactions to do what ostensibly should be common business processes?
Well, it's a great point, because if you think about all the money you invest, let's talk about S4 programs right now. We just touched on technology-enabled transformation. So many of those programs are looking to drive a very, very high degree of process standardization. That could be happening globally. It could be happening across multiple sectors. So a huge amount of time and effort goes into understanding how and what you can standardize and the impact that that's going to have on the business. Once you're live, if the users don't adopt that, the first thing they go off and do is find other ways to manage a process, and you end up with a high degree of off-system processes, manual workarounds, because they don't buy into, they don't adopt the solution, the business processes that you've delivered. Yeah. If you think about that in terms of process controls, you've lost the battle pretty much as soon as you've gone live.
And back to Paul's question on the difference in ECC and S4 here, in this context, is that just because you move to S4 doesn't change your adoption challenge. I hear lots of people say, yeah, but S4 is Fiori based. Well, some of it is. Some of the transactions in S4 are just GUI transactions, web GUI transactions. VAO1 is VAO1. You've still got to get people to adopt entering sales orders or building complex contracts or deciding which movement type to use. Yes, you can do things to simplify that, but I think you've got to measure it and consciously work ways of making sure users or business people are adopting things.
Yeah, it's a good point. Mobility and usability through app development does have a huge influence on adoption, but it's only one part of it.
One of my favorite stories here I heard on a podcast is when you have an iPhone and you drag the screen down and it bounces back up, the physics behind that curve, the bounce on there, has been obsessed by UI designers. You transplant that to an SAP world, nobody fascinates adoption to that degree, do they?
No, exactly.
So the fifth one?
So the fifth one is actually 0. And you can see a theme here. So business strategy and strategic thrusts. Why are we doing this anyway? If what we're doing doesn't align with the strategy and the direction of the business, then it's perhaps all a little bit pointless, unless all you're genuinely doing is looking after IT infrastructure.
I guess we didn't use that term strategic thrust earlier, though, did we? Which is a way of thinking about strategy in a way that drives concrete actions within your COE.
Yeah, and that's I guess we touched on it a couple of times. You talked about Hoshin Camry Stewart, and we talked about GPOs who have portfolio plans and roadmaps. So that's you think about the strategy being the articulation of where the business wants to go and the general direction of travel. The strategic thrusts are those things where the process owners themselves start to understand what they're going to do to enable that business strategy. And that's not just one thing. That will be a series of strategic thrusts that are going to help get you there. But making it absolutely clear, both to the business and to the technology teams, and in many cases, that's the COE straddled across both. Say, this is where we want to get to. How are you going to help me deliver against that? How are you going to help me achieve it?
Yeah.
So when we talked earlier about those organizations that understand the business strategy where there is one, the leading organizations know where the business wants to go. They know the direction of travel, the roadmap, the portfolio plan, i.e. the strategic thrust, and they know the part they play in actually helping the business achieve those.
Yeah. And also the key word, I put the text on here around blue ocean strategy, which isn't the only strategic model you can look at, but what I like about blue ocean strategy is it focuses on what's going to make you competitive. The words they use in the blue ocean strategy book is make your competition irrelevant. And if you think in those terms, what strategic thrust do you need to have to make your competition irrelevant? Now go and think about what your COE needs to do. And maybe S4 is the answer, maybe it's not. Maybe some things with an S4 are the answer, maybe it's not. And in lots of the road mapping work we've done recently with clients on S4, the answer has actually been a number of things. It's been a bit of best of breed, a bit of S4, a bit of cloud, a bit of value now, and adding some early improvements to ECC. But it's only because we're thinking of it in those terms rather than saying what's beneath the patio, should it be greenfield, brownfield, bluefield. If you adopt that mentality, you'll end up in Seattle for a while and maybe Chicago in winter. You're not going to get where you need to be. So let's quickly overlay that with three other things. And this is based on the last 12 months of working with quite a few clients in this space, things you can do now to feed this process. So one is getting an inventory of what you have in your systems today, isn't it?
Yeah, and which ties back to that, both the business process master list or the business catalog as well. So being clear in terms of the processes that are in scope and how they map and serve the application hierarchy. So, how is that functionality delivering against those business processes? That's a great starting point.
And what's custom? And we'll cover that in shortly, I guess, as well. What do you use? What don't you use? What are your interfaces? What batch jobs do you have? Have a really clear inventory, a definitive inventory of what's there now. Because if you do that, you can simplify. If you do that, you can be better in your clarity of roadmap and plans in moving forward.
Yeah.
I think the second one we had, there were three recommendations, weren't you? You touched on this before, Nick. Workarounds and tolerations. Should we explain the difference?
Yeah, and it's quite interesting. So we have a phrase which is value now, back to Paul's point about sweating the asset. And often when we're doing value now pieces of work, we talk with people in the business. So people who are running processes and using SAP as part of their day job. What's fascinating is when you've been running SAP for many, many years, as a large number of organizations have, the business employees, the people using the system, build up a series of tolerations. So they don't like the way it works, but they just get used to it and they tolerate it and they think that maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. So you either tolerate it or you start to work around it. You find other ways of doing it, and often that becomes off-system ways of working. It's certainly not going to be aligned with your process standardization. So you start to be on fairly dangerous territory once the business begin to diverge and diversify away from standard.
Yeah, and it links back to the inventory as well, which is, so workarounds can be people using Excel to do something that you thought they were using SAP to do. Yeah, but a toleration is, in my mind, is something that someone, it's like a squeaky door. It annoys you, but it's not worth getting the WD-40 out because you've got used to the squeak. Yeah. You're not bothered enough to log a ticket. You just put up with it. The last thing I think is understanding what's new and different in S4, and I've said etc. here because this isn't just about S4. Some people are on S4. It's the next release of S4. To Paul's point before on, now I have S4, what next? It's SAP's cloud solutions, cloud platform, integrations with best of breed, APIs. But unless you know what's in the box, if you're relying on others to tell you that, you have to bear in mind that the others that are advising you are either selling you services or licenses. So I think you've got to take responsibility for understanding yourself, what's new and different in S4, so you can start to look at what the art of the possible is, and also look at how that supports your business process improvement and supports your business strategy.
That ties back to Derek's point around self-sufficiency. So ultimately, that's what you want people to do, is develop their own internal expertise. And they have a very clear view of what's new, what's different, what's changed in S4. But that's the challenge we talked about previously around that sourcing model in a COE.
Yeah.
That's quite difficult information to get hold of. So maybe you do rely on your SI or your AMS provider, but that's not really helping your self-sufficiency. And they're only doing the same anyway. So having a better understanding internally of S4 and everything else associated with that, again, is where the leading organizations are.
Yeah. So I guess we've got a few more minutes before we start to kind of wrap up. So this slide here, which we'll make available, is kind of our one-page foundations for excellence. If you have a COE, whether you go in ECC, brownfield, greenfield, dirty third-party maintenance, something else, best of breed, that's our kind of takeaway advice on how to think about your COE, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah.
But when we were talking about this, you talked earlier about competitive advantage, and I thought we'd just touch really, really briefly on a way to think about your business process model and competitive advantage. So I'm going to do this quite quickly because you can download this from our website, and there's a link to this as well. We have this model that we call our package portfolio model, and it basically takes one axis of competitive advantage from things that give you a bottom line advantage, i.e. they save you money, to things that give you a top line advantage, they grow your business, or things in the middle that are just a commodity. So my favorite commodity example is posting a journal. You don't do a journal to save money or get new customers. You do a journal because you're trying to save money or because you have new customers. It's a necessary evil. The other axis of this matrix looks at how you've implemented that part of your solution. How does that business process operate? Are you using standard functionality? Have you heavily bespoke a package like SAP? Or are you looking at some kind of new vendor innovation, some shiny new cool stuff that's going to give you an edge? And we've done this a lot, and we usually take the business process catalog and we plot that against this matrix. And pretty much every time we do this, we see the wrong shape. We see a kind of a pear shape. People have over-bespoked commodity processes, but they've failed to bespoke or failed to invest in innovation in processes that should be driving competitive advantage. Now, if you want to do a business case for S4HANA, this is our way of doing a business case for S4HANA. You identify the processes that are the ones that drive your competitive advantage. You measure those metrics, and you identify ways of improving them. And if S4HANA can support that, cool. You've pretty much got a business case. The shape of this needs to be more like this. The things that are commodity deliver with out-of-the-box standard functionality, because that'll reduce the time to implement, makes them simpler to train, and reduces technical debt, makes them easier to test. The things that drive your top-line advantage or bottom-line advantage, then invest in bespoking things or customizing things, or invest in vendor innovation, shiny new things that are going to give you an edge. So just to overlay the points Nick made earlier, if you take an inventory of what you have today, it's easier to standardize and simplify that and move more towards standard. If you want to add value now in the short term, then take your business process catalog, as Nick mentioned earlier, categorize it in this way, and you'll identify areas that you can customize or bespoke in the ECC or S4 system you have today to quickly add value and prioritize those areas. Document workarounds and tolerations in those areas. Identify adoption strategies for those areas as well. We've got a great client who came to us, an oil and gas client, about a year ago, looking to do something quite big and scary and expensive in their procurement system. Our solution was actually to create a video, because it turned out their people just didn't really understand the difference between requisitions and purchase orders. They just needed a 5-minute explainer video. That simple adoption that cost a few $1,000s versus the 6 figures they were going to spend on the improvements solved the problem and gave them value now and let them focus on the right things and gave them cleaner data and gave them better reporting as well. So to Nick's point, focusing on immaculate data, all of this stuff you can do today without moving to S4. You can do it in your ECC system, you can do it in your non-SAP systems, but it needs a certain mindset, and that mindset is an improvement mindset focusing on business processes and a business process catalog. And that'll get you value now quite quickly. The contra to that is you also need to focus on value next, the slightly slower roads that lead to bigger value. But again, your process catalog and your improvement model should drive that. Understanding what's new in S4 and other solutions, again linked to your process catalog, again linked to your improvement model, drives that. And at the top of that tree, everything in there should support your business strategy. So if you can articulate your strategy, strategic thrusts, a detailed process catalog with owners and some categorization, but in place a simple improvement model, doesn't need to be Six Sigma, it can be just something straightforward. Focus on adoption, focus on data, capture your workarounds, understand what's in S4, and start to document and understand what you have today so you can simplify it. That's the best advice, having done this for 20 years together, that Nick and I could come up with for anyone who's trying to build a COE in the current climate for the 2020s. Just to show that visually quickly before we hand back to Paul, we've got a tool called Fusion Graph. Those slides I just showed you before, we can actually visualize in a cloud-based solution. So that's just a screenshot of that. And we can quite easily set up demos of that if people want to see it. But what you see there, the red squares are the process hierarchy. The yellow dots are roadmap items. The pink things are applications. And the stars across there are plotting those against competitive advantage left to right. So if anyone's interested in seeing more of that, you just need to connect with us with the details Paul's provided, and we can show that as well. And I want to finish before I hand back to Paul on, Paul mentioned this teaser of an SAP COE bootcamp. So Paul asked when we did this, could we give some kind of download away at the end of the session? And we've got lots of downloads on our website. We've got a really cool SAP COE toolkit you can download that we've built and kind of given away. What we decided to do instead, though, if people are up for it, is do a 7-week bootcamp to help anyone on this call to try and improve their COE. It's a series of 7 sessions that are action-oriented, that focus on some of the things we've covered today. If you register on the link at the bottom, each week you'll receive a task with an explainer video and some templates, and it'll move you through this process, with week 7 being producing a plan, a guided plan, that should allow you to start to be self-sufficient and set your COE in a totally new direction, focused on some of the things we've talked about today. And what we've also decided to do as well, which Nick and I decided, was it over a beer or a coffee? We decided it yesterday, that we usually do a COE strategy workshop that's quite involved and a lot of value. We've done it many times. And we used to do this as a face-to-face session. But because it's remote now, and because I think there's a need for this, anyone who does the COE bootcamp and gets to the end of it and sends us the final plan at the end, we'll do a COE strategy workshop for the rest of this year for 50% off, for half price as well. So if people are really up for making a difference and some of the things we talked about today sound appealing, then go and register, follow the instructions, see if you can complete the tasks. If you get stuck, ask and we'll help you. And then if you want to take it to the next level, then the offer's there of doing that at a reduced rate as well. And
yeah,
with that,
so just to reiterate on that, so that boot camp itself, it'll be a series of emails over 7 weeks for them to think about things and do some actions, correct?
Yeah, so it's a weekly email with a short video explaining some of the context as well, with a few links to read and a few pointers as well, and some simple templates that can be adapted. And it should be fairly self-sufficient, but if people get stuck or want to ask questions, just reply to the mails or go on our online chat on the website, and we'll try and help people through it. I think what we discussed, Paul, is it'd be kind of cool in 2 months' time to see if anybody wanted to tell us any success stories as a result of doing it.
Yeah, so a couple of things that Stuart and I talked about, setting something up, post these 7 weeks of string of emails for conversations around this. But I think, Stuart, the other thing I've been thinking about, there's a lot great stuff to unpack from today. Maybe we'll set up a future call for some more conversation and more asking questions about some of the things. Almost like flip learning. People take the time to watch this or rewatch it and then bring forward their questions in a session. So I want to be mindful of time. We're just about out of time. Great content, learned some great stuff. And now I know what to tell my mother about what SAP is. It's a big box of business processes. So I can definitely do that. Everyone learned about the blue house and the under the patio side. So lots of great insights. And I think, for those of you that are passionate about this topic, drop me a line as we look at our journey to our next generation COE, or whatever we might want to call it. Great topic. And I think Stuart and Michael would be very pleased and proud from above in terms of all your messaging is definitely in line with, I know, a lot of Michael thoughts as well. So well done, Stuart and Nick. So thanks. Kristen's still, go ahead, Stuart.
No, I was just saying thanks for the opportunity. It's great you've done a great job of getting a big audience on this. So it's good to be able to try and get everyone aligned and thinking in a similar way. It could make a big impact in the SAP space. So thanks to you, Paul, for doing that.